Now let's take a moment before we take a look at some more code. Let's take a moment to discuss the general way that people think about breaking down an app into smaller chunks. So I talked about how the basic approach is to chunk your app into small pieces, modular pieces, so that you can build each one separately and test it. And instead of having to, have this huge, long single program that you're trying to debug. And this philosophy also applies to not only mobile apps, but also websites. I mean, the sites that we designed last quarter were probably not complex enough yet that it would have made that much of a difference for us to think about it in this way, but we could have. And this is actually a good way to think about if you're designing an especially complex website or mobile app. And that is to break it down into what are called components. So what is a component? Well, a component is a small section of your site or your app that just does one specific thing. It has one specific purpose, not a multi-purpose thing. So when I look at, for example, our school website, it looks like this. If I were to think about breaking this down into components, I would think of it maybe like this. And the other thing to think about is there's no single right way to do this. Somebody might think of it one way, another person might group your components a different way, and there's no right or wrong. It's just a general philosophy of breaking things down into small chunks. So if I were looking at this site, one component that I might think about is the menu bar. So this bright red bar across the top, this menu bar, that's one component because it has a single purpose, which is navigation, to navigate the user to different parts of your site. So one component might be the menu bar. Another component might be this calendar here on the left. Okay, this calendar here might be a single component in itself because it has one single function, which is just to list out the events coming up. The news section in the middle might be another component. Single function is just to list out upcoming news items. And then the links here on the right, that might be another component because those are important links. You might even have a component for like the footer down here, this bright red section on the bottom, where you have like the address, and you have, look down here, you have some links down here. You have a login, search, and sitemap. That might be another component. You can even have nested components, so components within components. So for example, like this calendar section on the left here, that whole section could be a component, but each of the items in it, so each date within that could be another component, could be a subcomponent. So you could have a small component, which is a single calendar item, and then you put several of those together, and you get the bigger component, which is the entire upcoming events section. Okay, so you can break it down like that. And the advantage of doing things like that, breaking things down into components, is that you just write, when you're working on a single component, like for example, if I were working just on getting this single day event listing right here, just getting that to work, it's a small enough chunk that it's not overwhelming, it's going to be quick to write, and it's going to be easy to test. And if there's any bugs in it, which there inevitably are going to be, then debugging it is going to be pretty easy because it's going to be a small code base. Whereas if I wrote the whole page all at once and then I tried to run it at the end and then there's bugs, then it's hard to track those down. It's hard to debug everything. Okay, so the philosophy that people use when they're designing apps and nowadays sites as well is to break it down into components. Okay, and then you're going to write code for each single component separately, and then only at the end, once you know each of the components works, you've tested it and you know it works on its own, then you can put them all together into the big picture, the big piece, which is whether it's a site like this or whether it's an app like we're going to build. Okay, so remember that philosophy of components, because when we write our code in React Native, that's how it's broken down. You're going to break down your code into components.